to Salon Saigon yet, I would like to really introduce about our place. So Salon Saigon, it is the space that we call it a heritage and contemporary art space. We open from Tuesday to Saturday, so you can come back anytime after next week to visit our gallery again because we still have the upstairs. But at the moment we are locked and we're closed, so you can come next week. And we usually have an event about related to different pieces of heritage. And today we are so happy to have Mr. Andrew to come here to talk about the history of Vietnamese in Americas. As you know, Andrew Lums is the author from the US, and he have brought 3 books that we have over there that you might have a look later. And if you would like to purchase, you can do it after the show. Yeah. And for now, Andrew, may you introduce more yourself and also what you're going to talk today.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Can we get the screen going?
See?
Hello. I guess I'll use the mic. Thank you for coming. This is actually my first public speaking engagement in Vietnam. And so far I've been giving talks at private universities and colleges, but and certainly not on the subject of Vietnamese American history. So this is the first of many things. And I just posted on Facebook that it's a very odd thing to be giving a talk about Vietnamese in America in English in a city where I left in 1975 as a child, not knowing one word of English. So it's if there is a roundabout narrative, this must be it, to come back to your birth city, talking about a history of a diaspora that is not really well known in Vietnam, not at least publicly, and to be speaking in a language that is not my inheritance, certainly not my mother tongue. I spoke French before I left Vietnam, so that's my 3rd language. But that it is one that I find most useful, and it's about people in the US, so then of course it applies. May I just ask how many people here are Vietnamese Americans? Can you raise your hand? Yay, my people! I'm going to truncate 45 years of history into 45 minutes. And so I will satisfy very few and disappoint many, because one thing Vietnamese have in common is that we disagree on very many things. But this is really more conversational than a real study, because one of my experiences, actually I've written a lot about Vietnamese American as a journalist in America for many years. And I've written books, and I've written essays, and I've been on NPR and All Things Considered talking about the Vietnamese American experience. So I'm bringing a lot of personal anecdotes and narrative into the story. This is what I found when I Googled Vietnamese American. This picture showed up. I don't know who these people are, but they seem representative of the Exodus. And I'm pretty sure, if I'm going to guess, they're from Little Saigon. Just a feeling. That being said, my friend Haidai here grew up with me in the Bay Area, and he just flew in last night, and he was hanging out with his aunt. And his aunt, how old is she?
88.
88, wow. Gave me advice via Zalo, and she said that I should tell the story of the myth of Vietnam with Con rồng cháu tim, không? And so the children of dragons and fairies. Every country has a kind of mythology, right? And so Vietnamese mythology is that there were a fairy married to a dragon, had 100 eggs. Kind of silly if you think about it, but 50. They had a divorce. It's like the first Vietnamese history narrative is a divorce story. Because they split 50-50, just like California, no fault. And so 50 went north to the mountains and the other 50 went to the sea. And that's what she wanted me to tell you guys. But I think this version is the 2.0 version, because when we got to the sea, we decided to get on boats and get to America. So let's go with that story. So Vietnamese in America is an interesting story, because how many people can guess what's the population of Vietnamese in America before the war ended? Anyone knows? Yeah, go, you know because you're a vet, but go ahead.
10,000.
No, you're wrong. Mary, the former Consul General of U.S. Consul General of Vietnam, can you guess?
I'm not going to hazard a guess.
Okay, all right.
I know more the current, but...
So we have someone who went to Yale back in the 60s. And you were a foreign student in the U.S. during the war, right? Can you guess how many? Okay, I'm just going to... Okay, before the war ended, there were 1,200 people.
Wow.
1,200 people, 600 of them were wives of GIs who came back and their children. The other 600 are diplomats, bankers, and mostly foreign students. So before the war ended, there were less than 1,200 people in America. And you know why? Because Vietnamese don't really leave Vietnam until then. You know, the Vietnamese word for country has two different meanings. There's like, but the one that we use often is đất nước. Đất nước means country when you combine the two words. But when you say đất and nước, which is land and water, what do you think we get? We get mud. we get rice field. So the Vietnamese identity of a country is actually the rice field, agrarian life, sedentary, cyclical. And if you go to the rural, you still see graves that are buried in the middle of rice field that belong to the family. So when you die, you don't leave, you die in the land itself. And my mother used to tell me that when I was born, she buried the umbilical cord in the land in the garden, right? Because it's, you know, you have a birth certificate, but you also have a spiritual registration because there is a land-bound sentiment that is both beautiful and kind of time-honored tradition, right? So to leave Vietnam is not something that we do as a people, because unlike, say, the Jews or the Indians or the Chinese who had a history of diaspora, Vietnamese, until the war ended, were kind of sedentary, live and die by the land narrative people. But what happened after the war, after 1975, what do you think happened? Over 120,000 left within a few months, which is a shocking number given the fact that up until then, now from 1950 something to 1975, there were less than 1,200 people in America. It's a shock to the system, but of course war does give shock to systems, as we see now in places like Syria and others, that mass migration often comes from a violent expulsion. My story is that I left Vietnam at the cusp of the end of the war on April 28, 1975. And up until that point, my image of America is what a mythology, because if Vietnamese have mythology, America also has a mythology. And we had a driver back then, the chauffeur, who told amazing stories about Mỹ Quốc, you know, the land of the most beautiful land, the land of beauty, right? Mỹ is beautiful, right? Land of beauty. And it's a narrative that I still remember because he would say, America is so wealthy that you can drive for miles and you know, you don't stop and you will see orchards and peaches and apples, and you stop and you pick an apple, you eat, no one bothers you because there's so much wealth, right? And it is a narrative that we tell ourselves for a long, long time because the city where I ended up, called San Francisco, was known back then among Vietnamese that had translated from the other mythology from China is because of the gold rush. It's called Củ Kim Sơn, which is Old Gold Mountain. And the narrative is that San Francisco was the point of entry where you get gold on the street, right? And so it forced a lot of Chinese out of China because of this seduction of incredible wealth. And there is that dreamy narrative of what's available in America. My version of America was ice cream. because my cousin who came back from America had a poster of Baskin Robbins, 31 flavors. And as a child, I posted that on my wall, and every night I looked at it because I thought America is amazing because ice cream defied gravity. They had 31 scoops, and there are all kind of flavors. Back then, all we had was chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry, and nothing else. And yeah, but America is 31 flavors, and that's how I dream of America before I ever got there. And of course, this is the open road that my uncle, the driver, talked about, and the orchard. And the mythology was such that going to America was such a dream. And we have someone who actually went back from America, from Yale. And back then, once you have a bachelor degree, man, you're the #1 dude. Because to graduate from high school was already difficult. My grandmother had a friend, and he insisted that we call him Ông Tú Tài What, because he passed the baccalaureate. And back then, when you passed your Vietnamese equivalent to SAT, it sticks with you as a title, the dude who graduated with who passed the SAT, But basically, it's a tougher SAT than the American SAT. I can see Tim really disagreeing with that. But it's okay, equivalent to 2-year college or whatever. It's a title that you feel so proud of because so very few people. Think about it, 600 people in America. How many people, and some of them don't come back. So anyone who comes back becomes really powerful because he's educated and can speak English, Because going to America was really an impossible dream. No one thinks they can get out unless they're from powerful families, and that's a very rare thing before 1975. So then, we already talked about this, but before 1975, 650 Vietnamese arrived as immigrants. That's really few, Again, we don't have a diaspora. And I can tell you that when the Vietnamese get there, who's established from Asia? Chinese, Koreans, and Filipinos, and Japanese, right? So those were the traditional Asian Americans until the Vietnamese showed up on their shores. But then the population now changed. Okay, so then we have 1975, 125,000 people showed up within a few months. That's a crazy thing that happened in America because there is such a largesse back then. There was, of course, a moment of hesitation, but there is also an incredible largesse because, think about it, has there been such an acceptance of refugees since in American history? Definitely not with Afghans, and definitely not with Iraqis, and definitely not with Syrians or anything else at this point, and doubtful with Kurdish refugees if they ever make it to our shores. So that was the last moment of a large exodus that actually entered America, and it opened up a whole new landscape for America too, because of course, eventually Vietnamese also changed the American landscape. So then you look at these numbers, 231,000 came in 1980, from then to then. 1990, half a million showed up. So in history of Vietnamese American history, they will tell you that this came in waves. First wave would be people like me or Tin or Hai Dai who left at the end of the war. But then there are people who came as boat people right after. And in 1980 and 1979 especially, was a large population of Chinese Vietnamese who left, because there was a skirmish between Vietnam and China, and a lot of expulsion of Chinese Vietnamese who up to several generations back, and they left from Haiphong to the south. They all left en masse, and that actually was a large part of why now in Chinatowns around the U.S. there are a lot of Vietnamese Chinese who are sort of in between culture. They're making pho, but they're in Chinatown. And their pho, it tastes a little bit Chinese, but hey, as the French say, chacun a son goût, to each his own. And then you have migration that comes later and larger in 2000, 2010. But this population started to change because some of them are no longer refugees. You have boat people and horrible stories of people surviving on the high sea. People end up in dying on the way out, and so people stay in camps in the Philippines and Indonesia for years. But then you have people who started to get U.S. citizenship and then start to sponsor their family members over. And this population is also because they started having children. You see the small figures here. So they started having children, so then Vietnamese Americans are becoming more and more second in generations. So that's kind of interesting. And then now in 2010, 2018, there is a new population that is coming to America, and guess who they are? Foreign students. Thank you. You were going to miss that. So I went to U.S. Consulate General party the other day, and I got these statistics. Well, we're going to go back to the Pew, but there was an interesting statistic. I'm not sure which panel this is. But in 2002, there were only, I'm going to look for, I'm not used to this computer, but in 2002, there were less than 1,000 foreign students in the US. 2019, guess how many from Vietnam?
30.
Yeah, hey, you know, you were at the party too. So that number has increased quite a bit. And so instead of refugees or what you call reunification between families, you're starting to see just sheer foreign students who may come, and then if they're good, they get the H-1B and they stay. So then the immigration pattern has changed quite a bit, including rich Vietnamese who come over just to stay and shop. So I have been an interpreter for a handful of Vietnamese from Vietnam who come over and made me their translator because they need to buy a Hermes belt or a Gucci bag, a certain color.
A real one.
A real one. But what's so interesting is also there is a see this thing is not getting the whole image, but at the bottom here it says that an estimate of 160,000 Vietnamese are illegal immigrants in the U.S., meaning they come as maybe foreign students and overstay their visa, or most likely as tourists who then decided not to come back.
And they all work in nail salons.
They may all work in nail salons, and we don't know. But it's an interesting because we have estimated 11.6 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S. And Vietnamese undocumented immigrants only make up about 1% of that population, but it's 160,000 people. And they work in nail salon maybe, or restaurants, we don't know. But maybe this is why it's so hard for them to pass the visa test in Vietnam, I don't know.
Exactly.
Mary might want to comment on that at some point. But so as we can see, the image of Vietnamese America is changing along with the immigration pattern that has shifted. So this one is a really interesting link that I found. Can we get to the stats? Oh yeah. Oh, okay, can you make it bigger?
Yep.
Okay, so this one has all the interesting, let's see, how come I don't see it on the screen, on the laptop?
Bởi vì nó phải kéo qua bên này.
Làm sao em làm được không?
Mình dùng xuống rồi.
Because okay. So English proficiency in 2015, it's interesting because, I can't read this.
Do you want some help?
Yeah, it's
Press Windows and X at the same time.
okay. Okay.
On the computer.
Okay. So all.
Okay, I'll sit here.
Thank you. So foreign-born, only 34% can speak with a proficiency. U.S. born is 88%. which is surprising. You'd think 100. I think there's 12% that's stuck in Little Saigon, never left.
Not anymore.
But 34%, right? And among adults, 44%. And this is actually very low compared to all Asian, because 70% of all Asian have English proficiency. So in a sense, Vietnamese are kind of slow in catching up. But you have to consider also there are large Indian and Filipino population who already speak English pretty well before they get to America because it's their second language. Can we scroll down a little bit more? All Vietnamese American, length of time. So this is kind of self-explanatory, but 2005, I mean, basically, you have, more than half that's been here over 10 years. Been here in America, I mean. And the rest are newcomers. Okay, can we scroll down further? Education is also interesting. So US born, only 37% have bachelor degree, and 14% have higher than bachelor degree. Foreign born, 22% have some college education, 18% have college degree, and only 7% have higher degree than a bachelor. Compared to Asians, Vietnamese are also behind in terms of education. Although, I guess it's not that bad compared to all Americans. I'm just looking at the stats. I can comment on this whole thing. Okay, can you scroll down a little bit?
You're probably doing quite well.
Even though half didn't speak English. I mean, we shouldn't laugh, but hey.
It's okay.
So, then you have poverty. So, US born versus foreign born. Of course, foreign born tend to be poorer because, of course, it reflects their education level. That's sort of self-explanatory. Although it's kind of sad that there's still quite a few in poverty in America. So contrary to the myth of every Vietnamese who get to America and became rich, it's not true. Việt kiều don't always have money. Okay, can we scroll down a little bit? Top 10 US metropolitans. Okay, this is kind of like, my God, this is like taking over situation right here.
Yeah.
But the second biggest is San Jose. Makes sense. I will talk more about San Jose because, hey, that's sort of like second hometown for me. But the third one is Dallas-Fort Worth. I mean, third one is Houston, Dallas-Fort Worth. San Francisco is pretty big too. But you can see the large concentration is mostly California.
Yep.
And this is why so many people here would say, I have a cousin in Cali. Cali is almost like California. They don't want to say California. Cali. And Cali is the place where the connection tend to be. Like my uncle's in Cali. You have no idea what Cali is. Okay, can we scroll down a little bit? Among Vietnamese in the US. So, that's a lot of stats. Can we? Darn, can we skip this one?
Are you just seeing these?
Okay, this is more interesting. Median annual household income in all Asians is 3,000. In Vietnamese, that's lower, 67, right, for US born. But for foreign born, it's lower, 58,000, right? And when it comes to individual, right, it's 35,000 for all Asian, 24,000 for US born, but like 29,000. That's interesting. I don't know how to interpret that statistic. But in general, you can say that Asians in general, average Asian still make more money than a Vietnamese, against contrary to self-mythology of Vietnamese Americans. Because I can tell you among Vietnamese I know, we think we're the best. But when the statistics come, we're exactly not doing at the top of the pyramid scheme here.
But you're doing better than most Americans.
Yeah. That's kind of goes without saying. Okay, I don't care about unemployment because
I don't know.
But here, this one is interesting. So given the fact that Vietnamese make less money than an average Asian, home ownership is pretty damn high. 68% among foreign-born compared to 57. That actually an interesting statistic because it says something about Vietnamese mentality. Right? An cư lập nghiệp, meaning you have to get a house first, no matter what. And so you have Vietnamese who do anything, working 3 jobs just to get that down payment, right? And so that's a first generation mentality. You gotta have a house, no matter what, right? That's how you establish yourself. I think it's carried over from Vietnamese belief in Vietnam as well. But you think about it, you know, it's actually very low for American-born population. So that that mindset is definitely not transmitted that well to the second generation and third generation. And yet it's also very much bigger than this population, all Asians, who actually make more money. So you have Asians who make more money, who have less home ownership than the poor population that have homes. So Vietnamese stands out in that area because they believe that you have to have a home in America before you can progress. I think is there another statistics? Oh good, no more. All right, can we get back to my beautiful slides? Okay. Thank you. So yeah, so that's interesting statistics just so you can mull over. But for journalists out there, if you want to write about Vietnamese Americans, that's good statistics to have because that's the Pew researchers has done an excellent job on this sort of things. Okay, so now it's one of my pet peeve. Where's the arrow? Am I the arrow? Oh, here. So I want to talk about mental health because one of the things that Vietnamese also stand out in comparison to other Asian population in the US is that there's a high level of depression and mental illness among Vietnamese Americans. And that's something that is not well discussed within the community. If you look at the statistics here, 30.2% have depression. That's really high. We also beat the average American on this statistic.
Of course, of course.
And they tend to be female, which is interesting in itself. There's a lot of studies on this. But the other thing that that is really prevalent to Vietnamese American experience is PTSD. And PTSD is something that has to do with not just people who experience war from the first generation, but also PTSD because the trauma of the exodus that both people experience, fleeing from Vietnam, experience pirates and all these horrors, and then refugee camps. There's a lot of violence that involved in all these things in order for them to get to America. And that's something I write about actually in this book, Birds of Paradise Lost. But that's something that's hardly explored. And it's unexplored because in some way Vietnamese are not known to look into mental health as a way to cure themselves, because in Vietnam the language of mental health is still very new and unexplored. There are very few psychologists in Vietnam, for instance. And in the US, the same thing can be said of the Vietnamese American community, because people would tell their kids to become doctors, but they don't tell their kids to become psychologists, right? And I have a cousin who is a psychologist, died. And she tells me that I refuse to talk or take any of my relatives as patients, because if I do, I don't have any regular patients.
Right.
Because there's so many people with mental problems. And so that's how prevalent it is and how undiscussed it is. When I went to Berkeley, one of my Vietnamese friend went crazy. I think she had schizophrenia. But the family didn't know what to do. And it ended up in the news because they tied her in in a garage so that she won't harm herself until the neighbors reported on them. And you have to understand these are the undereducated parents, and they're ashamed of her, so they didn't know that there were help or whether there were help available for this young woman. And she was incarcerated, but unfortunately, so were the parents for holding someone against their will. And this is just an example of things that Vietnamese don't know how to process because of many reasons, including language barrier, but also cultural shame. It's about saving face. It's about thinking that you can cure these things by going to the temple and pray. That sort of thing. And it's still going on to this day. And there's a lot of suicides as well. And that's something that's kind of unexplored in the community because people just can't talk about it. And also true that Vietnamese Americans bring their own traditions with them in which they don't really have a way to talk about trauma, and it's very hard for them to share it. And so depression is certainly part of that story. And that's something that can be explored just by itself, honestly. So the story of Silicon Valley is interesting because I know it pretty well because I live very nearby and I have lots of friends in San Jose. And the story of San Jose and why Vietnamese ended up there is very fascinating because there was a camp in the south called Camp Pendleton where most refugees resettled or came to America, including myself. But the most available area for them to get out to was Orange County because when you have 125,000 people come to your shore, you have to figure out a way to cater to these people. And so one of the programs was to have Vietnamese being sponsored by American families. And so a lot of American families in Orange County volunteered to bring Vietnamese families out and stay with them until they get on their feet, that sort of thing. And so that's how the first Little Saigon formed. But the Little Saigon that formed right after that, from the period of 75 to 80, and then 80, the second migration from that area, mostly to the north in San Jose, has to do with the PC, the personal computer. Silicon Valley just started, just at the time when you have hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese showing up. And so then, by word of mouth, people say, hey, come up to San Jose. You can work in assembly line. And so Vietnamese dominated the assembly line, putting chips in the computer back then. And they even had the first Vietnamese adage in the US. And I wrote it down here, chồng tắt vợ ly đi làm cùng sếp, còn gì sướng hơn. It means, well, I missed a couple words, but husband, technician, basically, wife, assembly, working with the same shift, what's better, right? It's a witty saying because that and li also mean cup and glass, right, in Vietnamese. But it's also technician and assembly, right? And so that was the first adage because that was the first time when people came and then they can work and make so much money, right? So fast without learning a language, skill sets, right? You can learn in a couple months and you work in assembly line and work overtime and buy a house in a couple of years, right? And then so when I went to Berkeley in the 80s. I joined the Vietnamese Student Association, and in it there were about 150, 200 of us, UC Berkeley, and I would say 70 to 75% were EECS major, electrical engineering computer science major, because while their parents were working in the assembly line, they tell their kids like, hey, I see the managers, they're working and they're making a lot of money. So you study what they study. Just you make the computer, right? So a lot of these guys ended up working in Silicon Valley when they graduated. And then they eventually started their own companies, and eventually they outsourced it back to Vietnam, including this guy who sends. But anyway, so there is this whole narrative of Silicon Valley and make it rich narratives, right? And one of the more interesting story is not that the guy who just opened his computer store, but the Lee sandwich story.
Yes.
Lee sandwich is a family that basically, their last name is not Lee, it's Lay, but the people, Americans, I guess, couldn't say Lay, so they turned it to Lee. But it started with a food truck, right? Because all these assembly line people, they work on hours, and after 8 hours, they get overtime. So a lot of people work 14 hours, right? And they don't want to get out for lunch because that's an hour lost, right? So then this guy figured out that if he drives up to the assembly line factory, just park his car there with his sandwiches. Vietnamese would come out, eat it in 30 minutes and come back and work some more, right? And it became such a high demand because Vietnamese sandwiches are cheap, right? Bánh mì, the best in the world. But anyway, so then what happened is that next thing you know, he had to have another truck because there's another assembly line down the street, right? So then his brother runs that truck, and within a few years, it becomes a kind of mini empire, right? So this is sort of like a make it rich narrative that Americans love, and Vietnamese in Vietnam also love because it reinforced the idea of the land of plenty. Never mind that, there remains all kinds of issues. And so if mental health is an issue, so is the barriers in language and in the generation gap. And that's something I write what I call fragmentation within a community. The older generation tend to be extraterritorial, meaning they're passionate about the politics of Vietnam. They can be anti-communist and they protest. But the younger generation tend to be more integrated into American life. And they begin to become less beholden to that kind of politics and more interested in, say, identity issues in America, or racism, or feminism, issues that are not of necessary concern for the immigrant population. But the other thing is the language. The older generations continue to consume Vietnamese language media, but the younger generation do not. So then there is a gap that is both political, cultural, and also political in many ways. So, and it becomes an issue for many different reasons. For instance, an older generation who expected respect from their children become dependent on their children to get around. For instance, a mother who has to go to hospital cannot go to hospital without her son or daughter translating for her, for instance, or drive her, So then the power dynamics shift over time. And they become beholden to their children, and they don't get the children because the children become so Americanized as they go to school and so on. So that gap is very wide and continue to be widened. I give talks at different universities, and one thing that I always find amazing is to see second and now third generation Vietnamese Americans who come up to me and tell me that my books really help them connect to their parents because their parents don't tell them their stories, how they became boat people, how they got to America. So they don't know anything. And they say that, and I say, but there are all these people who wrote books about their experience, người tị nạn and stuff like this, But they say they cannot read in Vietnamese. All the books that are written are in Vietnamese for the first generation, a lot of them, older generation anyway. But the second generation may speak a few words or can understand a few sentences, but they cannot read in Vietnamese. So that even when they do scholarship, they cannot access their parents' books, because there is an ocean between them. And it's a very strange thing. If I were a multi-millionaire, I would actually have someone translate all of this stuff that, basically not available to second and third generation because we moved on from that juncture. And we sort of like now having a hard time accessing that memory. And so you look at it, So the Vietnamese limited English proficiency is pretty high compared to, say, Chinese and Korean and Thai. So you have a large population of Vietnamese still not being able to speak in English. And then you have American-born who sort of move from that, and so they cannot really communicate that well with their parents either. So it leads to all kind of issues that are also often legal. Because when I was a graduate student, I was moonlighting as an interpreter. And one of the stories that was very well known among interpreters was the story of this man whose son went to school and he had welts on his back. And and the teacher, it's like 6th grade or something. The teacher asked him immediately, "What happened to you? You have all these red marks, right?" And the kid, who's also an immigrant himself, didn't know how to explain it. He said, "My dad beat the wind out of me," which is cào gió, right? But cào gió in Vietnamese way is like to strike with the pointing or the spoon, right? But Americans at that point didn't know what the hell that was. Of course now it's known because Michael Phelps has all this dot on his back. But this is long before Michael Phelps came to the scene. And then they confronted the father and said, "Did you do this to your son?" And he said, "Yes." So he went to jail. Right? So it's not just a language barrier, but it's a cultural misunderstanding. There's a large gap because of language and cultural misunderstanding. And so there is still a demand for people who get what's happening. Just like when I was an interpreter, one of the cases I got was a woman who experienced trauma as a boat person. And she saw horrible things. And then she came to America and she suffered nightmares. And she went to an American psychologist. And of course the psychologist didn't understand the words she's saying. So I was hired to translate her dreams and her stories. And she talks about seeing her husband's ghost, right? And the psychologist immediately described her as having severe mental illness and delusion. And I told him afterwards that that's not true. Everyone in Vietnam seen a ghost one time or another, and seeing ghosts is not necessarily a symptom of mental illness, because half my family seen ghosts. So, and I don't think, oh my God, that's crazy. I just, hey, it's a manifestation of tradition. We pray to the dead nightly on the Bang Thao, right? So it's not as if this is not, so once in a while they talk back, it's not a big deal, right? But for the psychologist, she needs all kind of pills, right? She needs all kind of pills. And so again, it's a cultural gap that only begin to fill as we have more people who are from that culture to interpret these things, rather than the gringo who thinks he knows everything. He doesn't.
You're right. We don't.
Okay, so this is an interesting picture that goes along with just my pet peeve about language and exile. So who knows who these two people are? Can you? Yes, then. Oh, you raise your hand.
Yu Tử Lê, Ocean Yu.
Yeah, Yu Tử Lê. How many people who know Yu Tử Lê is? One kid, okay, and two. So Yu Tử Lê is a famous poet among Vietnamese Americans of some generation. He writes in Vietnamese, and his poetry has been used quite a lot in songs. It's very poetic, romantic poet. He just died a few days ago, and it's all my internet, Facebook thing. But he writes in Vietnamese. And he's lucky if he has like 5,000 people who bought his book of poetry, right? And he's very talented in his world. But again, this is the dilemma of language and acceptance in America, is that here's someone who has this incredible experience of being both a soldier in Vietnam and a journalist as well in Vietnam, and intellectual, and then a poet in America, whose work is well read among people of his generation, but no one else in America. Certainly not me. I know the song, and I know his name, but I don't really follow his work that well. So it's a dilemma, because I can tell you that there are now branches thing called Vietnamese American literature in America, and a couple of my friends are teaching it. But what they mean is Vietnamese American literature in English in America.
right? Because you have other people writing in the other language that is not known. And he's certainly one of them. So he's not recognized by the American institutions, right? On the other hand, Ocean Vuong is a star, a superstar at this point. You know, his latest book is On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous, and he just won the MacArthur Genius Award, which comes with $625,000. Not a bad award if you think about it. And incidentally, he's actually the fourth Vietnamese American to win the MacArthur Genius Award. Pretty stunning, isn't it? Yeah. And so Ocean Vuong writes in English, of course, and his poetry appears in the New Yorker magazines. He's profiled in it, and now he's sort of a star among poets and now a novelist. He's only 30 years old, right? So he has moved from the margin into the center of American literature, right? And then you have the other man on the left who is writing as an exile, right? And so they both come from a similar history, but because of language, one moves to the center. That's just an observation I want to make because I write in English as well, but because I'm older and I appreciate Vietnamese language, I find it intriguing, you know, what's accepted and what's not, and what's marginalized.
What are the three prior MacArthur Award winners?
Okay, the other MacArthur Genius was Viet Nguyen, who wrote the Pulitzer-winning book, A Sympathizer. There was another photographer whose name had escaped me. And there was a professor at Yale, I can't think of his name either, but he passed away. He was an anthropologist. Huh? Yes, he's very amazing. Yeah, Hun Sen Thong, right. He was the first to win the MacArthur Genius. And he actually sent me his unfinished manuscript, and he was looking at the language of snakes. It's a fascinating book. I don't know where it is now, but anyway, and how he's a linguist. You know, how the word snake translates from one culture to another, and how he has a theory that snakes, the fear of snake gave human their language. Anyway, again, he wrote in Vietnamese, I think, and I can't remember now. But yeah, so he was the first to win the MacArthur. All right, I'd like to make another point about achievements in America, because we're going to move to that. But before I forget, you know, unlike the other generations of Asians who have long traditions in America, like the Chinese and the Japanese, you know, the achievements that we see that are now being achieved are largely by first generation, not second. Well, of course, second tend to be younger, and they're going to be quite amazing too. But largely, so far, you know, Viet is also a refugee, and so on. So there is an interesting way of looking at first generation Vietnamese who are achievers. And not just their children. Children are expected to achieve as the Vietnamese kids, so they have to. But anyway, so American politics. There is a link. Can we, Emma, can we hit this link? Wikipedia is not complete, but it has a few names that are interesting. Vietnamese American politics. So you have on the seat Joseph Cao. You know who he is, anyone? Yeah, Ken. He knows because he's from New Orleans. Go ahead.
From New Orleans.
Yeah.
My district.
Yeah. And?
Oh, for 2 years only.
For 2 years only.
Yeah,
but he's the first Vietnamese to get into Congress, right? By fluke, really, but we don't have to get into detail. But anyway, of course he was a Republican, wasn't he? But then the second Vietnamese to get into Congress is a Vietnamese woman, and she's a Democrat. Yeah, I think she's going to vote for impeachment, by the way. I don't know much about her, but you know, there's a lot of news about her, and she got into trouble one time, but I don't want to get into that. But anyway, you guys know about her? Anyway, you can Google her, but that's pretty good, right? 2 Vietnamese in American politics, and there's a bunch of other names, including this one guy who actually assisted to Attorney General Ashcroft and sort of single-handedly wrote the Patriot Act. So I unfriended him on Facebook. Just kidding, I don't know. But interesting in any case. And this is the first, oh sorry, I'm going too fast. Vietnamese American billionaire, I think. Who's who in America is interesting because it's kind of gossipy. This guy was an interpreter during the war. Got to America with his family, and then he worked in the blood business, plasma, and then now owns 37% of a company called Shanghai something, I can't remember now. But he's worth about $2.7 billion. He's doing a lot of philanthropy work, he's Californian, and I'm not sure what else we can say about him, but he's quite dramatic. It's only his clothes. Anyway, people talk about him because he's a billionaire. He's like first Vietnamese American billionaire, I think. Viet Nguyen. People know a lot about him because his book, The Sympathizer, came out a couple years ago, and it made such a splash. He won like 6 major awards, including the Marconi Genius Award. And he went to Berkeley with me, but he's 5 years younger. He was a professor at USC, and it took him 20 years really to write that book. And now, because he's so successful and under contract, so they expect him to write the next one in 2 years. It's always like that. Okay, who's who in America? This is Mr. Sriracha. Mr. Sriracha was a boat person, and he is interesting because he was, you talk about a man with vision, right? He wanted to make chili sauce. But how he made it in America is a whole long New York magazine story about him, was that he wanted to have the best tasting sriracha, so he made 17 different formula. And he made people taste it all the time until he narrowed it to this one, because that's how meticulous he was. But it pays off, nicely, to say the least, because now sriracha is now in competition with ketchup to be #1 sauce in America. And you see them use it in like sushi restaurant as well as Indian. Like, it's such a hot friendly sauce that other cuisine are using it. I'm just waiting for the French to throw in some of their poulet marengo, and we know he's done, right? So I can pick so many interesting characters, but tonight we're just going to go through a few of them. Anyone knows? Okay, you cannot guess because you know everyone. Who is this person? Okay, so she's famous among military people in America because she's number 5 most important scientist in making military weapons in the world, and she's known in the Vietnamese community as the bomb lady. Yoon Nguyệt Anh. She was a boat person as well. I interviewed her many years ago, and she makes these bombs that went after Bin Laden in Afghanistan. Of course, the bombs weren't that smart because he was in Pakistan, but hey, so the bombs went into these tunnels, thermal barrack bombs, and they're supposed to tunnel the heat down to channel like deep down to get them in a cave, right? So her bombs did just that. It just happened that he wasn't in the cave; he was in villa, apparently watching porn from what I hear. But that's another story. That's non-Vietnamese. Sorry, Mary. But Yoon Nguyệt Anh is famous because she is like such a top scientist that she actually has her own guards around her. And I interviewed her. It was a very funny thing because I say, "Hey sister, how come you become a bomb expert?" And she said, "Well, when I was young, my parents wanted me to be a doctor, but I was deathly afraid of blood." That's a good quote for a bomb lady. So the last time I talked to her, she was in the middle of making bombs that are so smart that they can go to, let's say, if terrorists take over the 5th floor of the Sheraton, the bomb will go and knock on the door, but will hit that room and explode within a radius that is not much bigger than that room, you know. So it won't bring down the building. It just will destroy this room, you know. So and she was quite excited about it. Sheraton may not be happy to Sheraton. So again, first generation achievement story. Vietnamese love her because she makes bombs. I'm not sure why. So this is the Lee Sandwich story which I already talked about. Lee Sandwich now has 500 trucks in the U.S. And they also have stores, and they make their own banh mi, which in my opinion not the best dough. You know, it's too thick and too dense, not like, you know, not fluffy enough. But hey, that's because I'm expert on banh mi, so it's every Vietnamese I know.
I agree.
Yeah, but it's very popular, and the grandson of Mr. Lee, who the Mr. Lee passed away, the grandson met me one day. He told me that he got a contract with Costco to sell Café Ciudad in a can, right? And he gave me the Café Ciudad, and I swear I got high for 2 days. It was so concentrated, you might as well smoke opium with it. So Costco are going to have a lot of wide awake customers, so they can shop in midnights. Here's the scene of literature today. Is Monique True, who has a third book out. She's famous for her first book, Book of Salt. She won quite a lot of awards. Thi Bui, who is the first to, one of the first or second, but she won the National Book Award for doing this autobiography, really, of her family narrative of escaping Vietnam and coming to America. But what's so interesting is she's doing it as a comic novel, graphic novel. She's sort of like got famous for doing graphic novels as a way of telling autobiography. And of course, we already talked about Ocean Girl, who's now bigger than life, and openly gay, so it's fascinating stuff. Okay, this picture on the left is, I took this a couple of weeks ago at the American Center, where there is a collection of Vietnamese American authors' books, and I donated a few, so that's why they put mine on top. I'm going to send that to Viet Nguyen and say, hey, your books are borrowed. I don't think he gives a darn at this point because he's richer than God. Anyway, Vũ Trung is also a friend of mine. He's less well known, but very interesting guy. He breaks away from the traditional narrative of Vietnam War or aftermath narrative. And he's doing detective novels, right? So Vũ Trung's story is kind of like Las Vegas, gambling, kind of James Bond-ish narratives. With Asian character, but not like Vietnam War story or post-war story. So I'm glad to see that a new genre is now being played out. But this image on the lower right-hand corner says something about after 44 years in America, there is a genuine, how would I put it, renaissance of Vietnamese literature. Like we have come to the scene. And really it thanks to large part to Viet Nguyen who sort of broke the ceiling, but that now it seems to have, Vietnamese American narrative seems to be chic, that finally, there is a acceptance of authors from this community. And if you read the Sympathizer, his argument against Francis Ford Coppola book, movie, Apocalypse Now, is that anger. It's like American gets to tell the Vietnam story, but Vietnamese don't get access to that public narrative. And so there's a lot of anger in Viet that was the impetus for his book, really, because as a scholar, he did a lot of work on Apocalypse Now and how it stereotyped Vietnamese and so on. And so this is his response as a literary response to Hollywood version of Vietnam story, which is great. It's just great to see coming of age because years ago, when I started writing, a professor who's Vietnamese American, Miriam, at UC Riverside, she called me OG, original gangster, because there was no one around writing but me, right? but now I'm being put out to pasture because the young ones are incredibly talented and gifted, and kudos to them. So the next slide, I put this together because I just feel like it. But what I wanted to say in this is the story of Vietnamese diaspora to America. Changed the Vietnamese identity. We went from sedentary people to very worldly, cosmopolitan people, bilingual and multiple connections. But we also changed America in many ways. And Thich Nhat Hanh is only second to the Dalai Lama in spreading the language and ideas of Buddhism. When he came to Berkeley one year and I tried to attend, there were standing room only, and I never seen such aggressive Buddhists who pushed me out the door because they want to hear what the teacher had to say. And of course his message was peace and calm, and I got pushed out the door. But I'm not complaining, and I thought, hey, it's amazing that here is this man who brings a message of calmness. And you have all the Americans, of course, in need of calmness, and
Especially now.
In the piece. And of course, we get back to the banh mi because that is a picture from a cookbook that is a friend of mine, M.G.R. Nguyen, who's making a lot of waves because it's a fourth book on Vietnamese cooking, and the banh mi sandwich now has become sort of like one of those memes that kept going, right? And I always find it funny because I talk to Vietnamese kids here in Vietnam, and they have no idea that it came from France. Because, of course, they don't even know that France was like a colonizer in Vietnam because they don't have that much history memory. But the fact that it is a borrowed fare from the French art, right? The baguette to the pâté to the jambon to whatever, the pickle. But we really just add a few things and twitch a few things and made it our own. I guess that the French didn't have cilantro mostly, but whatever it is now ours, okay? And it's going around the world, which is fascinating, right? Americans didn't discover the banh mi from the French, who have been around for years, but then the Vietnamese showed up, and it's like, wow, a sandwich. I find that fascinating, right? No one's like, there's no cookbook how to make a French baguette, sorry, French. But so I find that like there is this proliferation, and if there is an argument for it, I think economically it makes sense because Vietnamese cheap labor with Mr. Lee, right? We used to be like mua hai tặng một, you buy two, you get one free, and it was so much cheaper than American sandwich, and so people were buying these sandwiches, and at first the assembly line people, but then non-Vietnamese started buying them, and they taste good and cheaper, right? So it makes sense that, banh mi and then pho as well became sort of an international recognition to us. And so what I'm trying to say is that Vietnamese don't just flee, we bring narratives with us, but we also bring cultural practices. And so what we do sometimes translate into other people's practices as well. So you can actually now find fish sauce in Whole Foods, right? You can find banh mi everywhere. And so...
But not for $1.
But not for $1, not anymore. And the lower right is a friend of mine also, Chloe Dow, who won the first Project Runway. So she's a big designer now in Houston. And so people are breaking into other areas beyond your traditional EECS or computer science or being a doctor or so on. So now you see Vietnamese American branching out, and especially in the cultural production area, quite a bit. And I just pick a few pictures just because there's so many names that we can pick, but this man is the first Vietnamese American to become a general. And he also was his first generation. He left Vietnam when he was 3. So it's quite amazing. And just yesterday, there's another Vietnamese who made admiral. So there's now 2 Vietnamese American who are generals in America. It's amazing. and of course this is 21 Jump Street, that's the Minh, who had come back to Vietnam at times to make movies. I don't know much about what's happening now, but he was already well known back in 21 Jump Street with Johnny Depp and all that. That's like 20-something, 30 years ago. And then this young woman is now like she has a cosmetic empire, and she started out, Michelle Phan, just doing YouTube video, right? And she became a YouTube sensation, a YouTube star. And she actually had contract with, I think, Revlon or something. Anyway, she was off YouTube, but now she's back on, and she's done quite well. And she parlayed her cosmetic know-how into having her own lines and starting her own company. It was really extraordinary. So again, influencers, I guess we could say. And here is an interesting picture, the one on the left. Cao Dai. But you know where it is?
Oh, no.
No, it's Orange County. It's in Orange County. Look at how orderly the parking lot is. So Cao Dai itself is spreading, right? So it's not just, one religion like Buddhism, but like Cao Daism is also spreading. And then you see all these things. All these vegetables didn't exist in America until Southeast Asians came. Because we don't just flee, right? Some people actually bring seeds with them. So they actually grow things when they got to America. I actually met a woman in a refugee camp writing about stories that she fled from Vietnam not knowing if there were rice in America. So she brought seeds with her, thinking that she might have to grow her own rice when she gets to America. That's how, uninformed we were when we left Vietnam many years ago. There was no internet back then, I guess. But so it's really an extraordinary shift in, from rice field to Silicon Valley, right? And a shift of identity as well. This is why, this is the book that I wanted to talk about, my first book. So there's a lot of transition that I talk about from war to peacetime, from being a refugee to an American citizen, and eventually a returnee to Vietnam, right? So all these things are still part of the Vietnamese American narrative, because the other influence we have is not just in America, but probably the biggest influence Vietnamese Americans have is actually in Vietnam. Because I remember during the Cold War, we used to send care packages home, and it was my job to roll $20 or $50 bills into a really tight roll, and then push it into a toothpaste tube, right? And roll and then put it in a care package, because back then people were inspecting. Sometimes they lose stuff, and so we would send the care package would note something like "Hope you smile," right? Because there's money inside the chest. But and it would take 4 or 5 months to get home. But we sent this stuff home, and then my mother would send letters of our lives in America. My dad bought a 2-story house with a swimming pool. The kids going to Berkeley, the sort of thing. And in some way, the care package is one thing, but the narrative that you can leave and become someone is more powerful than the care packages. Because it's proven that if you go to America, you too can become this, at least from the narrative that we tell through these letters that we send home. And so the sedentary narrative of who we are, for millennia, live and die by the land, broke really by the time by first, second, third wave. And then now, of course, going to America has become almost a norm for many people. But before 75 was a land of mythology, right? So these are the things I talk about in Cooking Dreams. And how that affects identity, and how it affects how we sense ourselves, the fragmentation, as well as this incredible reconnection with the homeland. So these are the narratives that I write about. And the second book is more celebratory, but sort of along that same line. East Eats West, and it deals with identity in America, and it deals with cultural changes in America. And then, so then I didn't really get to talk about the return, but I feel like you guys know about the return because it's, you know, so many people are doing incredible things in Vietnam. Someone is like CEO of a hospital chain, another one is running the bank, you know, another one is doing IT. People are, you know, doing incredible investments, and then a lot of people are coming home. But the most interesting thing about trying to find information is that very little statistics is available. How many people have gone back and who in Vietnam? It's all anecdotal. And I think Tin's the one that told me that the people who actually have statistics is the Vietnamese government, but they're not sharing. I like to have like who's coming back and who's doing what, but it'll be really interesting. And so the return, you know, I have this thing called Paris by night and startup, because when I first went back to Vietnam, the first thing I noticed from Vietnamese American that was clearly an influencer was Paris by night videos, and people were watching that. You know, they were watching that, and it was a big deal because back in Vietnam, people didn't have phong cha yet. You know, back in 20-something years ago, they didn't have discotheque, and so the entertainment they get from Vietnamese Americans were like really important to them, I guess. And but now, of course, Vietnamese are self-entertaining, and we in the U.S. now import Vietnamese over to entertain us because there's so many more talented people here than the U.S. in terms of music and so on. But one of the interesting statistics I saw was that 45% of tech startups in Vietnam is from Viet Kieu, and most of them are from the US. So that's saying that there is a return from Silicon Valley and other places where they bring technology, know-how, and they outsource it, and many are now creating, I guess, a bridge with technology back to Vietnam and doing incredible good stuff. But that's going to be discussed, you know, Tin is an expert on that because he's an IT guy, so you guys can talk to him about that as well. The one thing I find interesting is the issue of speed, because I remember my mom tried to call my uncle, speed and technology really, in the early 80s in Vietnam, and she had to call France. And France had to connect the phone to Vietnam, and we had to wait 20 minutes to have a conversation with him that got cut off within 5 minutes, right? And so, you know, speed forward now, and you can Skype anytime you want, right? Back then, it takes months for your money to get back, and they get back, and then you get this little telex that say, "Nhận tiền được rồi" or something, "We got your money," right? And now, you know, you can Zelle over or PayPal or whatever you want, right? And you know, it was so fast, and so the speed in which we connect has changed completely, and there is now a lot more integration because of that, and familiarity as well. It used to be that when I visit Vietnam, everyone knows I'm Viet Kieu because the way I look and talk. I guess they still think I'm Viet Kieu, but I mistake a lot of locals as Viet Kieu because their English is excellent, and they're taller and bigger, and they have this cosmopolitan demeanor. So what it is there is instead of contrasting, there's a lot of comparison now because of the new wealth and newfound status and new education here. And so I'm hoping someday there is no difference at some point, and that the bridges will be built such that we'll be just kind of like similar as the same people. The last image, of course, is my last book. Of course, I'm capitalistic, so I'm promoting my work, but the two images are 1975 and 2014 or something, and that's people leaving Vietnam at the end of the war, and these are people coming back with gifts and stuff from Pennsylvania Airport. So it's a whole shift of story within those two pictures, and there's still a lot of gap between us, between families, between community, between Vietnam and America. But as a writer, I can only say that these gaps can be filled if we are allowed to tell our stories and if we are allowed to listen to each other's stories. Okay, that's done. Q&A. Okay, Michael.
Mike.
Oh. Can someone help? Em do it.
Hi. My name is Michael Burr. I'm a Vietnam veteran. The 25th of September is the 50th anniversary of my arrival in this, my first arrival in this country. So I've seen many of the changes, and I'd just like to compliment Andrew on very entertaining and absolutely hilarious narrative you've given us tonight. And it's given me a lot of insights. I live in Southern California for almost 40 years and have very strong connections to the Viet Kieu community as well as the Cambodian community. And I think the Cambodians got you beat on the PTSD.
Yeah, you're right. Well, when I talk about PTSD for the Vietnamese, I actually really meant Indo-Chinese, Southeast Asian population that came, because so many came from war. The Hmong population suffered even worse because they were persecuted after the war ended, because they continued to fight. Cambodians because of the killing fields that went on in 2009 and after. So the trauma is unbelievable. But if we were to talk about Cambodian, there is also a renaissance that's happening now within Cambodian American population. Michael Siv is a good friend of mine. He's a filmmaker, and he is doing incredible work looking at the Holocaust through second generation lens. I would recommend his work if you are curious about because one thing we learned, and in this book of fiction, I deal with trauma, how it affects first generation for sure, but it also passed down invisibly to the second generation. So there is a way in which we inherit trauma and war, and it plays out in different ways. And it would help if we begin to address them, because it's unhealed wounds, really.
Yeah. I lived in Long Beach for 10 years, very close to the Cambodian community as well.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, thank you for your wonderful presentation tonight. Question I have is that, so tonight we've been talking about Vietnamese Americans, we've been talking about what impacts Vietnamese have had in the United States and overseas, and at the very end we discussed some impacts back here in Vietnam.
Yeah.
But taking it up a level, through your writing, your thinking, through your self-examination, through your contacts with other people from the same community, what have you learned about Vietnamese people in general, writ large?
Oh my gosh. I need a PhD for that answer.
But surely you have some observations that you want to share.
Yes, I think there are some things that continue to be true. For instance, this emphasis on education is incredible. I've seen it from different economic strata, broken family to whole family. This narrative of you have to be better than me is very endemic in Vietnamese mindset, right? The other thing is, family and doing things for family is important. That continues to ring true even for second generation in America. Less so, obviously. But I think there is also this incredible yearning for real conversation that has yet to happen, because the Vietnamese diaspora comes home, but we haven't really. I'm told this is the first lecture on Vietnamese American history in Vietnam, so it's kind of historic in some way, and I think it's long overdue. Because there's different ways of understanding each other, and it can only happen when we're allowed to hear each other, right? But that yearning is universal within those who stay and those who left. It's just unfinished stories that we want to tell each other. Within the same family, it's the same thing as well. So because you experience things at the same time, like war, right? But you interpret them differently as individuals. And you suffer differently and alone. So some people I have friends who are both people, two sisters, who saw horrible things, like, one of their sisters was raped and killed, right? But one became timid, and the other one became a world traveler, right? So even within the same moment of history, individual experience different. And how do they, but these two sisters never really talk about these things. I know them. Right? So there is a way in which Vietnamese hide themselves from confronting narratives. It's part of the Confucius thing, I think. You endure, but you don't speak, right? And there's no language for it. A friend of mine, Laksu, who wrote this book called I Love You is for White People. Have you heard of this book? It's because
Being married to a Vietnamese,
because saying I love you is just too much, right? So speaking about pain is too much. So I'm not sure we have time, but I'd love to read something. Do you have time? You guys want to hear this?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
All right. So there is this piece called karaoke. Emma, you want to help? Yeah. Cầm cái này. The title is called Singing in the Family. On the recent occasion of my uncle's 60th birthday, my mother's clan gathered from all over the country to celebrate at my brother's home in Fremont, California. Instead of gifts, however, my uncle, the youngest of 7 siblings, had an unusual wish. Everyone was asked to pick and sing a song on the karaoke machine. What began as an amusing exercise in merriment turned quickly into something I can only describe as our first and only session in family group therapy. When it comes to matters close to the heart, my family, like so many others from Vietnam, is notoriously inexpressive. Something within our taciturn culture discourages verbal intimacy. Immigrants and refugees from Vietnam, we rarely ever communicate to one another what we really feel. Our love and resentment are all hidden, our losses and sorrows often digested differently and alone. My uncle, who was going through a painful divorce, had not been able to convey to his family his profound sadness. He was still in love with his wife, but he was traumatized by memories of the war in which he took part as a pilot and prone to bouts of rage and mania and ranting while she's headed with him. He masked this with jokes and once in a while while drunk, Vietnamese men don't cry outward, our tears flow inward back into our hearts. But at the birthday bash, we all discovered that what we could not talk about, some of us could at least sing out loud. Thus, the cousin whose wife had filed for divorce sang Tom Jones' Delilah with a heartbreaking voice. And we managed to tell him that we were sorry for his trouble by singing along with every refrain. My, Delilah, why, Delilah? Another aunt, not particularly well liked for her condescending attitudes over the years, but who was now in declining health, took the mic to sing rather breathlessly, Somewhere My Love, the theme song of 1960 film Dr. Zhivago, dedicating it to the rest of us. Till then, my sweet, think of me now and then. She sang in a hoarse whisper and out of tune. Godspeed, my love, till you are mine again. A few of us cried quiet tears as we listened to the thin and frail woman sing Game Beyond. After a few more singers, it was Uncle's turn. He chose a well-known Vietnamese song titled Come What May, I Will Always Love You. In Vietnamese is Dù sao đi nữa anh vẫn yêu em. This is a beautiful voice, but halfway through, as he looked at his 3 grown children staring back at him, he choked. Another aunt, his closest sister and confidant, quickly grabbed his mic, put her hand on his shoulder, and finished the song. Meanwhile, my uncle's tears were flowing outward finally, and in front of the entire band. That afternoon, I watched and listened in amazement as my relatives laid bare their hearts before me. It was as if in poetry we could finally converse what in prose, in conversation, we couldn't. Words, when sung or turned poetic, somehow became acceptable and even welcome in our uncommunicative culture. And as I witnessed the sadness, memories of moments with my own immediate family rushed up before me. I saw again how timidly my father tried to hold my mother's hand in front of us one evening, and how she, embarrassed, pulled her hand from his grasp and failed to see the subsequent hurt look on his face. In the 50-odd years that they've been married, my parents, to my knowledge, have hugged twice in public and held hands on 1 or 2 rare occasions while they watch TV. This practice repression is as old as the history of Vietnam. If you love, show the king, is an age-old adage about how one should raise one's children. Thương cho bọ, cho roi cho bọ. Thank you, local person. But I saw too my long-dead paternal grandmother late one night tiptoeing to the living room to put an envelope between the pages of my older brother's math book while we were still newcomers living in a crowded apartment on Mission Street in Daly City. He had been trying to save enough money to buy a used car so he could drive to college. On the envelope, in which she put half of her Social Security income, she wrote succinctly, "Nói cho con," for my grandson. And I saw myself stuttering that evening long ago, a few years after college, unable to form Vietnamese words when my mother asked, "What's wrong?" Everything was wrong. I had wanted to tell her. The love of my life had left, and I was bleeding inside. But that was not our way. And my Vietnamese is unruly, refusing to give lyrics to the murmurs and pangs of the heart. All I managed to say was, "Nothing, Mom, I'm just tired." I recall too that first time when I won the journalism award, and my father tried and failed to say something in Vietnamese. Finally, he said it in English, "I'm proud of you." Then a quick pat on my shoulder. I was stunned. "Thanks, Dad," I said, and looked over my older brother, whose face was an expression of astonishment. He said it to the wrong son, I thought, and inwardly I was thanking myself for refusing to let fulfilling my father's expectations or failing them be my goal and foibles in life. If emotional restraint and proper displays of outward behavior are still considered the utmost beauty in some Confucian mindsets, the muted endurance is still considered a virtue. And these ideals, when practiced blindly, fail many of us who now live in the complex modern world called the West. Show, don't tell is a millennial-old ethos. But despite my mother's subtle way of saying "I love you" in the impeccable sweet and sour catfish soup she serves whenever I visit, the lack of verbal communication leaves me wanting. And was it not why my lover left me? Please don't leave, I love you. A radio and commentator and a writer, I am a traitor now to the old ways, for my medium is the written word and my playground is the public forum onto which my private passions spill. The written words are now my songs. Yet if I manage to say so much in public, I too have failed to say the things I wanted to say to the people I love the most. Things that need saying. The old ways in familial settings remain overpowering and the tongue refuses to bend so that the words prepared in reveries are never by me spoken. So what song did I sing at my uncle's birthday party? I sang many songs about broken hearts, about lost innocence, but the one I dedicated to my entire clan was Carole King's "You've Got a Friend." You know the lyrics. When you're down in trouble and you need a helping hand and nothing is going right, close your eyes and think of me and soon I will be there. It's corny, I know, but it's the only tune I know how to carry well and whose lyrics I had memorized. And it approximated the sentiment I felt. So in front of my family, I too sang my heart out. So that's a long way to answer your question. But okay, next, anyone? Yeah. Oh, and Bogey, thank you. My knee is not working well, so I can't run. Right.
Hello.
Hi.
My question is, after writing all these books,
Yeah.
I was curious, what are some of the when you get someone to read it, and editors who are not VQ, what are common feedbacks when they read it and you're like, well, they're saying the same things again, like common things that they say that they kind of don't understand, but they edit, and you're like, well, it's kind of like that.
Yeah, they don't get a lot of things that are very obvious to Vietnamese, but for instance, when I say the chauffeur is my uncle, like Uncle Phước, right? Because we don't just say his name, right? In Vietnamese, we have personal pronouns. And Vietnamese language is always flooded with pronouns that is familial. And so the editor's like, if he's your chauffeur, how can he be your uncle, right? Right? And I say that's because that's the language we spoke. And so the gap is really a cultural one. And you know, one of the more interesting writers is Junot Diaz, you know, who wrote The Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. Wow, how do you say this last name? But wow,
Oscar Wilde.
Yeah. And what he was doing was really funny, because when you try to write about another culture in English, there's a lot of misunderstandings. And so what he does is a lot of these footnotes, but his footnotes are like half a page, right? And then so you're like, okay, so you're a gringo, you probably don't make sense, so here's the footnote, so read it, you know. And it's, but hey, you know, it's a very well-received book, and I loved it because it's sort of like he's making a statement about how when you try to write authentically about something, someone's like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense, because people read you from their own cultural perspectives.
Yep.
And unfortunately, that's the story.
Again,
sorry, we're going to have to give other
okay.
people. I'm trying to be democratic in this country.
I can see it. I can see the floor.
As you studied Vietnamese, Americans, and Vietnamese in Vietnam, do you see a major difference in the Vietnamese character of those two groups? How are they different?
The Vietnamese character?
Yes.
In Vietnam versus the Vietnamese character in America?
Yes, in the sense of being Vietnamese,
Yeah, you know, I think I think there is a way in which we expand the pie. I think that if I was to be honest, I think Vietnamese character is one of adaptation. I think Vietnamese tend to not know that they have a built-in ability to adapt very well. You think about it, a lot of our, what we think is traditional culture is adaptation, right? Even the cow dye thing is adaptation. And we have religion that we adopted from China, and then later on Catholicism came from France. And it became integrated in Vietnamese life in a way that we think it's Vietnamese, right? So there is an ability in which we continue to take in foreign ideas and regurgitate it as our own. And so I think there is a way in which Vietnamese Americans do the same thing. Because there is a difference between integration versus assimilation. Assimilation is that you just take in the other value and be as your own. But Vietnamese, I think, came to America at a time when that assimilation process no longer works that well. And everyone insists on the kind of hybridity and so on. So then it gave us a lot of chance to say, hey, wait a minute, you know, we might like mac and cheese, but hey, you got a trace all for us as well, right? So there is a way in which we make it work for us, you know? I think in some way it might be why it reflects so well on the first generation to be super achievers. Because we already came from a place of adaptation. I learned English very fast, not because I spoke Vietnamese, but I spoke Vietnamese and French. And so it's only a matter of a couple of years before I became fluent. So that adaptation was already built in. And if there is such a thing as a core experience, I would say that's who we are. Mary.
Yes, so I understand you recently taught a creative writing workshop here in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested in what your experience was and what the Vietnamese youth who participated in this was.
Wow. Well, 3 of my students are in the back, and they're not exactly they're actually practicing journalists. But so I taught a sort of like a master class in creative nonfiction and in the genre of literary journalism. So I think I want to expand the pie in which these people work. Because they look at journalism in a very simple, straightforward way, but in America we practice literary journalism in such complex ways. If you read a New Yorker magazine, you can see how it played out, from Truman Capote to Joan Didion, and so on. So I brought that notion to the class and helped them think outside of what their norm is, and I think it really expand the way they look at nonfiction and how it can help them. Whether or not there is space for them at this juncture, I don't know, but you can give the seed and hope it grows in the future, I guess. If any of the students want to speak, you're more than welcome.
Just a few about the first one is
Okay.
You in Spanish too much and I think we got too much inspiration from you as overseas teachers. This is the first time you teach the youth, Vietnamese youth here, and we learn from you all the norms about how to be creative in writing, not in shorts, but in literature. And the most important part we learn from your course is that we love our language, my mother tongue, and we love about the English language, and we know how to be creative in our writing. Thank you very much.
Any other question? Oh, wow, slide.
Got one quick question. How do you get the guy who's the billionaire on the project that translates the guy who's the older poet?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
You know the billionaire who you showed before?
Yeah.
And there was the older poet, not Ocean, the
Yeah.
guy to the left.
Yeah.
How do you get a project going where he would fund the translation of artists who you need to do it now?
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but many people don't think this way. The billionaire that we see is absolutely fluent in Vietnamese, right? He was an interpreter in the war. He's 75. So for him, he can read the existing literature, so he didn't recognize the need of the second generation at all, right? And I don't know him, because if I do, I would probably, listen, right? But the gap is that, there's a lot of people with wealth who do not recognize the problem, right? And a lot of people don't see the problem until you talk to kids in college who say, I want to write about Vietnamese American experience, but the stuff of re-education camp of both people experiences in Vietnamese, how do I translate that? And I say, I don't know, right? It's amazing because there are schools, universities that would translate Vietnamese history narratives here into English, but they themselves don't recognize both people's story in Vietnamese, So there is a gap there. There is definitely a gap. Yeah.
Hey, Andrew. So this is something I've been kind of conflicted as a visual artist. You were mentioning that there is, kind of a sort of a new coming of second generations and beyond.
Yeah.
Sort of telling the stories of their parents, and there's many opportunities where I would sit around the table and listen to my parents talk about their narrative as like Vietnamese boat people. And as sort of like the next kin person to tell their story, I'm often conflicted about sort of navigating between where do I come in as like continuing their stories as opposed to like exploiting their stories too. So I was wondering if you have any advices on how to encourage a lot of second gens and beyond to tell their parents' stories as well as tell their own stories.
That's a very good question. Because there's a lot of infighting within the Vietnamese American artist community, and some would say you're not authentic enough, right? The word authentic is always a key fighting word in literature as well as in art, as my friend Din Lei, who's very well known, will tell you. But how you do it, is to find a creative tool to make it work. You know this play called Vietnamese? Have you seen it?
Yeah.
Vietnamese is something you definitely have to see because it's written by a second-generation person about refugees in Camp Pendleton. But it was so amazing to me how he played it out because it's not just access to the story, but he addressed the language gap as well. Because how do you tell the story that is told in Vietnamese in English, right? And make it real. So what Vietnamese does is that it makes all the characters speak fluent English. And not only do they speak fluent English, they speak English with jargons, right? And the American in the story speak broken English. And it took you a while to realize that this is his take of how, his imagination of how they would sound like if they were to speak English. But he's listening to them in Vietnamese and it comes out in English. You know, so he filtered it through his own experience. And so then, of course, the American who spoke English brokenly is because he spoke Vietnamese in the story, but you didn't know that until halfway through. Then you realize, that's why, right? So he's telling a story that is inversed, right? I wrote a short story similar in the book Birds of Paradise, that's called Grandma's Tales, in which she's the one that becomes fluent in English, right? So there is a way where we reverse things, and so you have to play with form. You have to play with expectation, and your burden is more than just being a historian, but how to find a creative tool and passages that will make it adaptable to your generation.
Can I go again?
Only if there's no other hands. There's another hand. Wow. What an enthusiast.
Thank you for the talk. It was very entertaining and informing. I am a Vietnamese and so what you were saying was very new and informative to me. I have a question. So you were mentioning throughout your talk, through your books, that you are interested in identity of Vietnamese American people. And so as a Vietnamese, I am curious about your take on it as someone who is Vietnamese and then you went to US and grew up there and so encounter very different cultures, and also I'll be interested to know from your experience or from what you observe from other people in the Vietnamese American community, maybe from a second and third generation. How is it like in terms of your identity as a diaspora?
Yeah. Well, the identity question is an eternal question. And if the immigrant who comes to America has an identity crisis, I would even, conjecture that America itself is going through an identity crisis, native born as well. Because it's not only those who cross borders that become confused as to who they are, but America itself is fighting over the definition of who is an American right now. And so I think it's a time of art. It's a time of people who are in the world of literature and art to really fight to identify and expand that narrative of who we are. And if you read my work, I deal with it from being someone who was born in Vietnam and think he was a patriot to South Vietnam, to someone who fled to America and became identityless as a refugee, to become this American kid, to becoming someone who accepts his multiple connections around the world and his fragmented biography as his inheritance. So it's a process of alchemy, I think, to come to terms with who you are. But one thing I do learn is that identity is definitely not etched in stone, but it is a layer add on like an onion. And sometimes a layer dies, but you add on other onions, layers. So we are in a process of becoming. And I think that's the role of art when we start discovering that we have overlapping interests, no matter if you're Vietnamese or Vietnamese Americans or anything else. One of the more interesting cartoons I saw was probably in the New Yorker or some other magazine like that, where there's two people at the bar, the cartoon, two women, and one is saying to the other, like, hey, Marge, my boyfriend finally opened up to me. And the other would say, how so? And she said, he finally let me look at the bookmarks on his laptop. And why is this interesting for identity question? Is because if you look at laptop identity bookmarks, we have like 100 of them, right? Yeah. And if we compare, we might have some in common, you know, be it French cuisine or anime or whatever it is. And we have a lot that's not in common. And if you think that who he is revealing himself to this woman is that he is all this fragmentation, right? Then I think we are getting closer to the reality of who we have become. Because the moment you say Vietnamese or American, you're already distilling it to some kind of fixed identity that is not changing, or we assume is not changing. But we live in an age of incredible complexity, right? Within Saigon, you have many multiple strata of people who identify themselves with this group and that group and subgroup and that other group. And that I think, it's like a complex three-dimensional Venn diagram where we have, places in common, and often we don't, right? And that's what makes us interesting. And to be able to address all these things makes it more interesting than to reduce ourselves down to like, I'm Vietnamese or I'm American. Because it really says nothing to me at this point. Any more questions? I think that's it, right? There's one more, and then we open up for just party. Yeah. The last one in the back.
Hi. What has inspired you to be a writer?
What is my priority?
No, what inspired you to be a
writer? Oh, because...
And who were your mentors, role models for?
Oh my gosh. If you read East West, I talk about how I became a writer. I think the story is like, love your parents but follow your bliss is the title. I was a biochem major at Berkeley, and I was going to be a doctor. Right? Graduated, was studying for the MCAT, and then instead of going to medical school, I took UC Extension courses in creative writing, and the teacher just thought I was gifted, and she sent my work to the master MFA program at San Francisco State, and I showed up and one day and she said, Andrew, you're not going to medical school. I said, why not? It's like, you're going to creative writing school because I sent your work to them and they say, just fill out the application and you're in. And my first line was, oh my God, my mom is going to kill me. And I filled out the application and I got in. But the narrative behind that is that I started writing because I thought I had a broken heart. I did, I had a broken heart. And I thought I was going to write about it after college, romance, my biggest romance, I only had one, but it was big. And then I quickly discovered that you cannot write about broken heart when you're still like falling apart. You don't know the whole dimension when you're inside the room. So it wasn't very good. But then I came back to it a few months later, and there was a passage. And the passage that I wrote says something along the line of, if you love someone and you share your life with that someone and share a routine with that someone, and you lose that someone, it's like losing a country. You become an exile. And when I read that passage, I cried. For the first time after the breakup. And I realized I wasn't crying about the heartbreak. I was crying for Vietnam. I as an 11-year-old kid, didn't know what the hell happened to me when the war ended and I lost the whole country and became someone else. I never addressed it. And the heartbreak, the romantic heartbreak, opened up a venue in which I began to address what it is to be a refugee, to be an immigrant, to lose a country. And your dogs, I lost 3 dogs. But anyway, and so I began to write seriously, about a broken people, And the words kept pouring out,
and I started winning awards. And then next thing you know, I became a writer. I guess things happen, but that's how it happened.
Thank you.
Wait.